Hello. So last time we spoke, we talked about the situation in the French colony. It's deteriorating. It built New Orleans. The city of New Orleans was established now. It's doing fairly well under John Law, but the problem comes in because John Law's company starts to collapse. It was a Ponzi scheme. And I suggest you look that up to get a proper definition. But in essence, what a Ponzi scheme is, it's an idea where you start off with investments and people initially invest. And then suddenly there's excitement about the investment and everybody wants part of it. So the initial investors can sell their stocks for a tremendous profit and live well. And other people see this and they want some of the same, so they jump in. And it goes on and on until finally it runs out of steam. And individuals then begin to realize that I'm not going to be making that kind of money. I think I'm going to sell. And just like there was an accelerating purchasing process, there becomes an accelerated selling process where suddenly the stock loses all of its value. And that's in essence what happens to John Law's paper money scheme in France. And as a result, it infects the problem of the colony he's established here in Louisiana. So the second problem they're going to have is they're going to have two very unfortunate events pertaining to the Natchez Indians, who have been friendly to them from the very beginning, helping them in so many ways. But the ignorance and arrogance of two French military men will cause the demise of the Natchez tribe and a destruction of much of the colony itself, the French colony. So the Mississippi bubble bursts. It's called a bubble because it just expands like a bubble till they can't hold it anymore. News gets back to France about the tremendous hardships. John Law had been sending out all sorts of false propaganda advertising about the wonders of Louisiana. And some people believed it and they came. So despite the Mississippi bandits who rounded up the poor unfortunates on the streets of France and drove them to Louisiana, there were some who willingly came. They believed the stories. Then they started writing back home, some trying to return, discussing the disease, the hunger, the misery, the poverty, and the horrors of that voyage, both ways, going to Louisiana and returning from it. John Law's land of paradise, as he best described it, word came out that more resembled Dante's Inferno, hell on earth. There was no gold, no silver, just hard work, very hard conditions, shortages of just about everything. And unlike they were told, the Native Americans, though helpful, were not going to dedicate their lives to serving the French. Investors then started running from the stock. When they heard bad news, they start selling because they don't want to be caught with a stock that's losing. If rumor gets out that the big investors are starting to sell, everybody then rushes to dump their stocks. France had over 2.5 billion lire in paper money. That was really, for the most part, unsupported. A lesson here. We're doing much the same thing today in America. We keep borrowing and printing, borrowing and printing, borrowing and printing. This is what happens when you do that. Paper money was devalued by 50%. That means that if you had $1, you got 50 cents. If you had 1,000, you got 500. So you can see why people were anxious to leave the stock. The king was forced to dismiss John Law. He would escape to Belgium, which was right across the border from France, on December 10th, 1720. This is just 2 years after the founding of New Orleans. You literally have a situation where people are throwing rocks at his carriage as he flees. He'll end up dying in Italy years later, a destitute man. Conditions in New Orleans did not take well to the land because the people who came were led to believe there was more here than there was. There was so much to do. You had to clear the land, plant the crops, and you had to build a city. All this had to be done with your labor or with the available company slave labor. Nearly 1,000 people would come in the whole 10 years. A low levee now surrounded the city on three sides. Shallow drainage canal was dug from the back of the city to Lake Pontchartrain to help drain the city, which continually had trouble with flooding. We know that today. Drainage ditches and banquettes were constructed. They finally built their church, but this time they built it out of brick. And they had four small forts constructed in the corner of the city: St. Jean, St. Charles, St. Louis, and Burgoyne. It's around this time that the Ursuline nuns arrived. This is perhaps one of the most positive experiences. They needed to bring high caliber women in. They couldn't keep bringing people from prisons and prostitutes from off the streets. This was not building a community. These were people of very low caliber. So as a result, the priest turned to the nuns in France and asked if it was possible through the church to start bringing some suitable women to town. Father Barbeau, a Jesuit priest, persuaded the Ursuline nuns in Rouen, France, to establish a convent in New Orleans. The purpose would be to house young women coming in and take care of them, and to also act as for education purposes, and obviously to aid in the ministry of the church itself. 9 nuns, 2 postulates. Postulates are 2 ladies in the process of becoming nuns, and a cat started out for New Orleans. Their job, as I said, was to educate young girls, and eventually they would find the responsibility of caring for the sick, for which they gained the unquestioned love of the people in the city of New Orleans. The Jardin was the name of their ship, and it was a miraculous journey across the Atlantic. It nearly killed them when they just left France because it struck a reef. That's a terrible situation, because usually when that happens, you break the bottom of the ship, water floods in, it sinks, and you're stuck on the rocks and people drown. It just so happens that they were able to get the ship off the rocks with no damage. Following that, 2 very serious storms at sea followed. On each of these events, the nuns immediately dropped to their knees, broke out their rosaries, and prayed for God, to the Blessed Mary, actually, to save their lives so that they could begin their ministry in Louisiana. They survived the storms. A pirate ship attacked, which is usually something you can't defend against because they're so much faster. But for some reason, again, the nuns prayed to the mercy of God, and sure enough, the ship was driven off. By this time, the captain's beginning to wonder. He's endured these disasters, but survived them all, when mostly one would be enough to sink the ship. He's undoubtedly gaining tremendous admiration for these nuns. When he gets to Dolphin Island, it runs aground again. You'd think this trip was over with. They did, after they ran aground, they started what's called lightening the ship. You start throwing everything over the side that's not essential until you get to some essential things. The idea is to make the ship lighter so it floats off. They were just about to start throwing the nuns' property over the side when the ship floated and they were able to get to Dolphin Island safely. From there, they loaded them on pirogues, which were small boats. They paddled to the Mississippi River, and from the Mississippi River, they paddled up the river to the city of New Orleans. It was a 5-day trip from Belize, which is at the mouth of the river, to New Orleans. Sometimes it took as long as a month, but in this case, it was 5 days. And to give the idea of what it was like, one of the nuns who kept a diary wrote, "Squatting mosquitoes and looking for snakes and alligators is more tedious and treacherous than the reefs, storms, pirates, and running aground." This will give you an idea what the introduction to New Orleans was like. They arrived on August 27th, 1727. It took them 5 months. Now think about that. 5 months at sea with bad water, bad food, and all the travails they experienced along the way. When they arrived, Father Barbeau was thrilled. He brought them into the rectory, gave them an opportunity to clean up, wash their clothes, have some good food, and then begin the process of contacting the local people to establish housing for these nuns. Once they got themselves established and the convent was built for them, they then had their responsibility of bringing young women in. These women would go through the casket. Soon thereafter, they became called the casket girls because the casket is the term in French. Casket is not that you put a body in. A casket is a hope chest. That's something this generation knows nothing about. But when I was growing up, young women got hope chests. You know, you first got a chest, hope chest, when a gentleman was interested in marrying you. Before you got an engagement ring, you got a cedar chest. It was made of cedar because it protected. Cedar is a wondrous wood. It's got a strong aroma to it, and it keeps moths and other things away. So they would get a hope chest to put things in and collect until they got married. In this case, these casket girls, their hope chests, contained all the essentials that they needed for when they arrived in New Orleans. They were then housed with the nuns, and the job was to provide high caliber wives for the good men. And there were some, especially some Canadians coming down who were living here. The hope chest held all their personal belongings. These are the first women of absolute, unquestionable character to arrive in the colony, except for those Germans who already arrived and married for the most part, except for the potential of some daughters there. And obviously, the men in the colony were thrilled to have women of colony so they could build families. They were soon married, as the nun said, even one who looked more like a soldier on guard duty than a young lady. In fact, this last lady almost caused a duel between two men because she was the last one to be selected, and two men were anxious to have her company. So you can see the attraction of women of caliber that was brought here. This is a hope chest that we have today called a cedar chest. And you can see the size of it. And women would, young girls would start filling this thing up. And then eventually they would get an engagement ring, which is another level of certainty that you're going to get married. Then you would get married. And with your hope chest, when your holidays, your birthdays, or Christmas came along, relatives and friends would give you things for your marriage to put in it. Other areas of development, Baton Rouge was established in 1719 by the Artet family. Casa de Artet was given a concession 5 leagues loss of Natchez on the bluffs of the country in the savage tongue of the Ursuline Indians. And if you notice, Ursuline is still the mascot of many of the teams up that area. In 1722, there were 30 whites, 20 slaves, and 2 Indian slaves, so it wasn't heavily populated. The family tried to change the name, but there was no way of shaking the original Baton Rouge. It was going to stay. Rapides, further up the Rev River, they established Rapides Parish. In the colony of Rapides, it was a small stockade with a chapel. It was called Rapides because that's where the rapids were in the water. In Natchez, the population of 100 people, inclusive Indian and black slaves. They raised wheat, corn, tobacco, beans, and vegetables, had a good trade with local Indians, and traded with the Spanish. This is all, again, because of Saint Denis. Saint Denis maintained exquisite relations with the locals, made sure that they were treated with respect, and there was a great interchange between the two groups. Along the German coast, which was further up the river, Germans and Swiss immigrants produced grain and livestock, and they would be the source of much of the good food coming down to the city of New Orleans. And at Mobile and Biloxi, they continued to grow, but the focus was now more on New Orleans than there. African slaves, prior to 1717, there were few slaves in the colony, but the need for labor forced the company to import more slaves. 1719, the Duc de Morine and the Aurora arrived carrying 500 slaves. Again, these were owned by the company. If you were a very wealthy individual, there were a few like that, you could perhaps purchase one. The slaves were very expensive, and the company required cash. Few people had that amount of cash. The same year, the company built slave pens across the Mississippi River in what is now Algiers. So the slaves were kept across the river from the city itself, likely for fear in case something would erupt, a slave rebellion or something. They wouldn't be in too close proximity to the city itself. 1724, the number of slaves and free blacks had grown so numerous that Bienville decided that they had to establish a code noir, a black code, set up a legal apparatus to handle the situation. You also had free people of color here. And that's a very interesting story. And that's why I urge you to read Mary Gaiman's Free People of Color in New Orleans, because New Orleans and Louisiana were unique in the amount of free people of color that lived here and thrived here. The Code Noir, interesting. First thing it did was all Jews out the colony. There was very strong anti-Semitic attitude throughout Europe at this time. It forbade any religion other than Catholic. That was the French. The French had a large community of Huguenots that they drove out of France. These were very productive people. And had they sent them to Louisiana, the whole immigration story would have been completely different, as well as the production here. But they refused to let them go anywhere. Catholic France was Catholic France. Slaves must be properly fed and clothed. Slaves must not be shackled or tortured in any way. Slaves must be cared for in sickness and old age. They could not assemble if they belonged to separate masters. This was obviously an attempt to prevent any kind of conspiracy. They were not permitted to carry weapons, but that's not really true, because a lot of the slaves went hunting and they would be given the gun by the owner and a piece of paper saying that, look, you have the right to carry this. So they were able to carry weapons. They just couldn't own their own. They could not marry whites, but at the same time, you had a lot of relationships between slave women and French masters. So when you look at this black code, it looks completely strict. But when you drill down into it, you find there's a lot of haziness, especially about the idea of abusing slaves. It was against the rules to do that, but that doesn't mean it didn't happen. They could not sell goods without master's permission. But remember, under the French, you only worked a half day on Saturday and you were off on Sundays. And Sundays at Congo Square, slaves were allowed to gather and dance, play their traditional music, and trade and sell. So people would sell whatever they had, pralines or handmade items, whatever they had, and they were able to generate their money that way. And the French allowed that. The Spanish will be even more open to these sorts of things when they start taking control. There's a slave revolt in 1730. A slave named Samba sought to foment a slave rebellion. The goal was to kill all the French and turn the colony over to the blacks and to the Native Americans. There were 7 other men and 1 woman involved in this conspiracy as fomenters of what they wanted to do. It's uncovered because a slave woman got into an altercation with a French officer when he struck her. And she looked at him and said the French would not long insult her people, which was an outright threat. He became alarmed and he had it brought before the authorities. What do you mean by that? She likely was placed under torture, in which case she's committed to the fact that there was a slave rebellion. Lepage de Prats, remember, he's a gentleman that's from Holland that gave us the early accounts of the Native Americans. We talked about the magnifying glass and all that. He was a member of the Superior Council at this time. So when he heard this woman's words, he made a rather astute conclusion. Words said in passion and drink are true. You know that as well. You get somebody who's drunk and they say something, they may sober up the next day, say, oh man, I didn't mean to say that. Well, you're right about that. You didn't mean to say it, but you said it and you meant it. It's just that you didn't mean to say it. Not quite the same thing. And that's what he felt. There's something here. And eventually they find out. He starts going around at night and listening to the different slaves in their quarters in the city to see what is going on here. And in the process of doing so, one evening he overhears a conversation about the revolt, and he's shocked because the voice he hears is Samba, who is his slave. And he always perceived him to be a personal friend and confidant. He was his valet. The woman was hanged, and the 8 men were broken on the wheel. Broken on the wheel was a traditional penalty for treason, and it's incredibly brutal. What they do is basically tie you down on a wheel that's laying horizontal, and then take iron bars and break your arms and legs, starting at the bottom of them and working up to the thighs. Then eventually they'll just draw and quarter you, open you up on the inside, and if you're still alive, they'll strangle you with the intestines. It's an incredibly brutal way to die. At the same time, now relations are starting to solid with the natives. The French had developed incredibly good relations with local Indians by trading with them. They worked together, they supported one another. They even lived near one another. In Natchez, colonies of Frenchmen were living among the different Indian groups, and the Indians would help them harvest, and they would loan the Indians guns to go hunting, and they would split the goods. So there was a great relationship between both sides. Nearly 300 settlers lived in the Natchez area, and two of the Natchez had even visited France, which is interesting. If he likes to know what their story was, what they thought of France when they came back to the New World, because the impression had to be somewhat amazing. But all of this would change in relatively short order. The first incident breaks out when an abusive behavior and arrogance of two French officers would cause the death of many settlers and the collapse of the company, destruction of the colony, and the destruction of the entire Natchez tribe. The second Natchez War, remember the first one was an incident with Bienville. As a young soldier is owed money by a Native American. He's actually the son of one of the great sons. He owes him money, and the older Indian doesn't have it. So the young man starts debating. The Indian makes excuses. I don't have it. Now, come harvest time, I can bring you whatever you need in corn or what have you. But until that happens, I don't have anything. The young man debates him, starts reviling him, abusing him. The Indian can't take it, so he starts walking away. The soldier, in his anger, takes his gun and shoots the Indian. Now, the local Natchez see this whole thing take place. They're furious. They run up to their blood brother and carry him off to their medicine man to see if they can save his life. At the same time, they're looking at the French to see, what are you going to do about this? Because we know if an Indian had done something like that to you, what the response would be. Here, you've done it to us. What's that response going to be? Nothing. The soldier was not punished in any way for what he had done. That was a mistake. Indian culture demands revenge for an incident like this, and it follows their custom. I don't have to go after the man who committed the crime. I just have to go after a member of your tribe. What happens is the young Frenchman coming down the Mississippi River in a canoe stops along the bank of the Mississippi, sets up his camp to rest. The Indians surround him and kill him. They got their revenge. One life for one life. What ends up happening is a bloody warfare breaks out. Not terribly brutal as far as numbers, but it's serious. And it'll last for about 3 or 4 days. It quiets down because of Dupratz. The Indians come to Dupratz and he works for peace and he achieves it. The trouble is, it takes time for word of what happened to trickle down to New Orleans. And when Bienville hears about this, he's furious. He comes up to Natchez with some soldiers to discipline the Indians for what they did and starts ordering men around to command an attack on the Indians, despite the fact that the situation had been settled. Now, I want to read something to you. This is from Dupratz. I'm not really good at reading things, don't particularly like to, but sometimes you have to. What's happened here is Dupratz is living in the Natchez district at this point in time. And as I said, he's very friendly with the Indians, especially Stung Serpent, who's a dear friend of his. And he was a brother of the great son, who was the chief warriors. So one day he's walking past. This is after all these events have settled down, and even after the events pertaining to Bienville have been settled. I accordingly called to him, that's Dupratz to Stung Serpent. We're not formally friends, and we no longer so. Stung Serpent responded, "Noko," that is, I cannot tell. Then he replied, Dupratz, You used to come to my house, and at present you pass by. Have you forgot the way, or is my house disagreeable to you? And the Indian replies, as for me, my heart is always the same, both towards you and all my friends. I am not capable. Why then have you changed? He took some time to answer. And at length he broke the silence, and he told me, this is from Stung Serpent. He was ashamed to have been so long without seeing me. But I imagine, said he, that you were displeased at our nation, because among all the French who were in the war, you were the only one that fell upon us. You were in the wrong, said Dupratz. To think so. Mr. Bienville, being our war chief, we are bound to obey him, in like manner as you, though a son, are obliged to kill or cause to be killed, whomever your brother, the great son, orders you to put to death. Many other Frenchmen besides me thought an opportunity to attack your countrymen, in obedience to the orders of Bienville, and several other Frenchmen fell upon the nearest hut, one of whom was killed by the very first shot which the Natchez fired. Then Stung Serpent replied, I did not approve, as you know, of the war our people made upon the French to avenge the death of their relation. Seeing I had made them carry the pipe of peace to the French. This you well know, as you first smoked the pipe yourself. Have the French two hearts, a good one today, and tomorrow a bad one? As for my brother and me, we have but one heart and one word. Tell me then, if thou art, as thou sayest, you are my friend, what thou thinkest of this, and shut your mouth to everything else. We know not what to think of the French, who, after begun the war, granted a peace and offered it themselves. And then at the time when we were quiet, believing ourselves to be at peace, people come to kill us without saying a word. That's when Natchez returned. That's when Bienville returned and restarted things. Why, continued he with an air of displeasure, did the French come to our country? We did not go to seek them. They asked for land of us because their country was too little land where they were pleased. There was enough of them, and for us it was good that the same sun should enlighten us both, and that we should walk as friends in the same path, and that we give them of our provisions, assist them to build and to labor in their fields. Have we not done so? Is this not true? What occasion have we for the Frenchmen? Before they came, did we not live better than we do? Seeing we deprive ourselves of part of our corn, our game, our fish, to give it to them. In what respect, then, have we occasion for them? Was it for their guns? Bows and arrows which we used were sufficient to make us live well. Was it their white, blue, and red blankets? We could do well enough with buffalo skins, which are warmer. Our women wrought feather blankets for the winter and mulberry mantles for the summer, which indeed were not so beautiful, but our women were more laborious and less vain than they are now. In fact, before the arrival of the French, we live like men who can be satisfied with what we have, whereas at this day we are like slaves who are not suffered to do as we please. That's a mouthful. That says a whole lot about the Native American attitude towards the French. So despite the friendships, there were problems that were growing. The Third Natchez War. This is in 1624. 1629, 5 years later, it breaks out again. A ragged and half-starved, half-dead man arrives in New Orleans. He told the excited people that the Natchez Indians had suddenly attacked and massacred the men, women, and children at Fort Rosalie and at St. Catherine. Those are two areas that the French mostly lived in the Natchez community. He survived only because he'd been away from the fort. He heard all the shooting, he heard the screaming and crying, and he looked through the woods and saw it. He knew there was nothing he could do, so he ran back to the city of New Orleans. That's 200 miles, just to give you an idea. This occurred again because of the arrogance and stupidity of a Frenchman. In this case, the local officer in command, Colonial, who was the commander of Fort Rosalie. He had been removed because the people hated him and informed Governor Perret in New Orleans that he had to go. So he was removed. But then he prevailed upon Pierre to let him go back again. And for some insane reason, the governor reestablished him as the leader of Fort Rosalie. That was the problem. By this time, Dupratz had left Natchez, and he had gone and moved out of New Orleans. So what we get here from his story, we likely get from Dupratz talking to the natives, the Natchans, who survived what was taking place. And before they were shipped to Haiti, he had a chance to discuss with them what happened. This is the view here of the grand village of the Natchez. This is likely where most of the French were. And this is White Apple. This is a traditional village that belongs to the Natchez. This is the Grand Village, the different mounds. If you go to Natchez, the Grand Village is right downtown. It is a beautiful museum there. It's definitely worth the visit. So this is the 1724 war that we just finished talking about. And you can see the Grand Village, and here's Fort Rosalie. And this is the massacre in the Third War, November 29, 1729. 230 colonists were killed. And then the retaliation will wipe out the Native Americans. So what happened exactly? How did this whole thing transpire? Well, sadly, it begins. Jean de Chapart had been removed, but then he's returned. He looked over the lands when he got back and decided he wanted a plantation. So he cast his eyes on White Apple and figured this would be a great place for me to establish myself. So he ordered the son, the great son, to come to him. And he told him that, I want you to remove all your homes and everything you have from White Apple because I'm going to take it over. The great son looked at him and said, there's no way. I mean, White Apple has been a Natchez village for as many years as I have hairs in my head. It's one of our most traditional villages. You've picked an area somewhere else. We'll help you clear the land. We'll help you establish it. But you can't have White Apple. Chapart became angry. He says, you will move, and I will not take a place elsewhere. He then started berating the son and treating him almost as a slave. The son was offended, angry. He tried to appeal to a sense of reason, but there was no way. Chapart grew angry and again verbally attacked the son. Quietly, the son walked out the room and he left. Once he arrived at the village, he called all the old men of the village together. Remember, it's the elder council that makes major decisions, to discuss the matter. They decided that they had to delay for time. So the son went back to Chapart and offered a deal. He says, listen, we can't leave now. The harvest is in the ground. Give us till harvest time. Let us harvest our crops. And in fact, we'll give you a share before we leave. Well, Chapart's thrilled at this because he not only gained acquiescence to take over White Apple, but he gets a significant share of the crops that he can sell and make a profit. So he's great with this idea. At that point then, now that they've got their delay, the son returns to the tribal council and says, look, it worked. The plan worked. He then decided that they'd wait and hold another council, which they did. Now, I'm going to read again. This is from Dupratz, likely, from an interview with the Indian. In 5 or 6 days, he brought together the old men, that's the chief, and the interval were consulting with each other, which was the reason that all the suffrages were unanimous and the same and only means of obtaining the end they proposed for themselves, which was the entire destruction of the French in the province. At this point, they realize that if this is the commander of the French have to go. Enough's enough. The son, seeing them all assembled, said, "You have had time to reflect on the proposition I made you, and so imagine you will soon set forth the best means of how to get rid of our bad neighbors without hazard." The son having done speaking, the eldest rose up. He saluted to his chief, and then he said, now this is so interesting, quote, "We have long been sensible that the neighborhood of the French is of greater prejudice than benefit to us. We who are old men see this. The young see it not. The wares of the French yield pleasure to the youth. But in effect, to what purpose is this? But to debauch our young women, taint the blood of the nation, and make them vain and idle. The young men are the same case, and the married must work themselves to death to maintain their families and please their children. Before the French came among us, we were men, content with what we had, and that was sufficient. We walked with boldness every road because they were then our own masters. And now we go groping, afraid of meeting thorns. We walk like slaves, which we shall soon be, since the French already treat us as such. When they are sufficiently strong, they will no longer dissemble. For the least fault of our young people, they will tie them to a post and whip them as they do their black slaves. Have they not already done so?" He then goes on, "What wait we for? Shall we suffer the French to multiply till they are no longer in a condition to oppose our efforts? What will other nations say of us, who pass for the most ingenious of all red men? Then they will say we have less understanding than other people. Why then wait we any longer? Let us set ourselves at liberty and show we are really men who can be satisfied with what we have. From this very day, let us begin to set about it. Order our women to get provisions ready without telling them the reason. Go and carry the pipe of peace to all the nations of this country. Make them sensible that the French, being stronger in our neighborhood than elsewhere, make us more than others feel that they want to enslave us. But when they become sufficiently strong, will in like manner treat all the nations of the country. That is their interest to prevent so great a misfortune. And for this purpose, they have only to join us and cut off the French to a man in one day, in 1 hour, and that time to be on the term prefixed to obtain the French commandant." In other words, the day we're supposed to bring the crops to the French commander, that's the signal to start the slaughter. To carry to him the contribution agreed upon. The hour, several warriors to go and carry him the corn. At the beginning of the several payments, also carry with them their arms, as if going to hunt. And that to every Frenchman in the French house there should be sent 2 or 3 Natchez to ask to borrow arms and ammunition for a hunting match, on account of the firing of the commandant when they hear the gunfire from the commandant's house, to be the signal to fall at once and kill all the French. And then we shall be able to prevent those who come from the old French village by the great water ever to settle us. That means after they do that, they know they'll be counterattacked, but they'll have complete control. And with their local tribes supporting him, they'll be able to keep the French from reasserting themselves. So you see here the story as it's unfolding. So what happens? They start planning their attack. The women are denied information. The men decide that they're going to contact the local tribes. Now remember, they don't have a written language. So what they do is decide that they can count. So they take bundles of sticks and figure how many days it is to the day they're going to do this, and put as many sticks in each bundle to match that. And the idea is, as they go to each tribe, they present them with a bundle of sticks. And they inform them every day, take out 1 stick. When 1 stick is left, that's the day for the attack. Join us. Of course, as I said, that the women were kept out of the elope. Women had a very strong role in Natchez society, especially the mother of the great son. So she starts getting wind that something's going on. She can see it. She can see the women busily collecting reinforcements. She sees the men are acting in ways that they don't normally act. They're cleaning their weapons, they're preparing weapons, they're making weapons. So what happens is she becomes angry. Something's going on that she doesn't know about. So her name is Stongarm. So she asks her son, the great son, to come with me. Come with your mother. We need to visit relations at another tribe. You can't tell mom no. So he agrees. And they walk. And she takes the long walk. Now, most guys will understand that. But it's very hard if your mom leans on you to hold your mouth shut. She has ways of getting you to spill your guts, generally. And that's what happens. She takes him on the long way around where she has plenty of time to work him. And then she realizes this dealing with the French. And we don't know what transpired between them, but she likely kind of agreed with him a little bit to get him to open up. At which point he disclosed everything to her. She's furious because she realizes that there's no possible way they can win this thing. And this will likely be the destruction of the entire tribe. So when she gets back, she tells a soldier friend of hers about the threat, tells him to inform Chapard. The soldier does, but Chapard is so arrogant, he immediately takes the man and places him under arrest for cowardness. The next thing she does is particularly unfortunate. She finds the bundle of rods in the Natchez, and she takes out 3 sticks. That means the Natchez will hit the end of their bundle 3 days before the tribes they aligned with, which means they go it alone. On the eve of St. Andrew, 1729, they go to Chapard. The shooting starts when they kill Chapard. They then start slaughtering most of the Frenchmen. Some are relieved because they've got such close relations with the Indians won't kill them. But of 700 people, nearly 300 are killed. The rest are captured and few escape. This is when word of that one individual who works his way all the way down to New Orleans, 200 miles, gets to the governor. At that point, he organizes an attack to reestablish himself, and he turns to the Choctaw, who are likely part of the conspiracy. But now they're angry because they feel like the Natchez moved ahead of them because they wanted all the goods in Fort Rosalie for themselves, because Rosalie was a supply house. The Natchez have entered the supply house. They've looted it for everything they can. And sadly for them, they uncover significant amounts of wine and cognac, and then they start drinking and celebrating their victory. So the other tribes surrounding now feel like they've been betrayed by the Natchez, and they end up joining with the French to punish them. As a result, they attack the Natchez fort once they get there. The Natchez release their prisoners. They're surrounded, or mostly so, but the French aren't doing an effective job, and the Natchez realize they have a problem here. So they escape the fort at night. They go downriver to the Tunica tribe, and they want them to help them. When the Tunica refuse, they kill the Tunicas. They then work their way across the Mississippi River to the Red River and start working their way up the Red River. The French follow them. They build a small fort, and the French surround them a second time. By this time, they brought some small artillery, and they're hammering the fort. At night in the rain, the Natchez seek to escape again, as they did the first time. They can't. This time, they're totally encircled and besieged. They're forced to surrender. Those who aren't killed are brought down to New Orleans. In New Orleans, they're imprisoned until the ship arrives, and they're loaded on the ship. They're brought to Haiti, where they're sold into slavery. This is likely that period when Duprat's asking what in God's name happened, where he was able to get the story from the friends of his among the Natchez that he knew. Some escaped to the Choctaw and the Chickasaw. Some even went so far as to join with the Cherokee. So that marks the end of the Natchez tribe. The French response, they joined the French because they believed they were betrayed. 1,600 men. For 5 days, they attacked a grand village. As I said, they escape, killed the Tunicas. The French army catches up. They're captured. Results, through the abusive action of 2 French soldiers, several hundred French settlers are massacred. The French colony is completely threatened. People run to the city of New Orleans because they don't know how extensive this is. And a lot of people are living among Indians and out in the open on their plantations. Relations with local Indians are destroyed because any trust that was there is completely shattered now. Because some of the Frenchmen then attacked the Indians in their neighborhood thinking they might be involved, and they weren't, in which case then these natives are furious. The Natchez tribe will completely cease to exist just 48 years after welcoming the French for the very first time. The Company of the Indies, which even though it had gone bankrupt in 1720, was still functioning as an entity, especially as related to the Company of Louisiana. But when word of this Indian massacre hit, it was driven into absolute total bankruptcy. The settlement of Natchez is totally abandoned and will be so till the British take it over in 1763. There'll be a war with the Chickasaw. We'll get into that later because Bienville, when he comes back, wants the Natchez who did this, and that'll trigger a war with the Chickasaw. And for the next decade, any development in Louisiana is completely cut short. So conclusions, the French occupied Louisiana from 1699 to 1672, 63 years. During that time, they settled several areas, but never completely built a prospering colony. The royal government had no idea how to do it, and the private investors proved even worse. The final straw was the Indian massacre of 1730 that destroyed what little progress had been made. Thus, when the French left Louisiana, one can actually be said about their occupation, other than that they occupied Louisiana. So they will become a royal colony again after John Law's demise and the collapse of his company. And the next lecture will talk about the 3 French governors who take over. But the days are numbered. Things are not going well. It's not a functioning colony. And next time we'll talk about those final days of the final years of the French involvement here in Louisiana. So please take care.